G'day and welcome. Thanks for coming along, Megan. Great to have you on a little episode here today. We're going to cover some things around governance, obviously, because you sit at the head of the Governance Institute. And, you know, a lot of people might think, well, governance, what do we really need this for? But I see there's a lot of things that, in my observation and the interactions we have with people, I don't think people quite get the implications of what good governance is and how far-reaching it is. So I'm going to delve in a couple of areas with you, and we'll explore that together, if you're all right for that.
Great, thanks for having me.
Cool, thank you. So the first area is really around the whole role of management, the whole role of leadership. We as leaders and managers have grown up in an environment, in a situation where most of our team members are within sort of kind of arm's reach, or at least they're on a different floor, like a walk into their office or something to that effect. We may have had offshore staff and whatever not, but we're now moving into a situation where, you know, a lot of people are either working from home or working remotely, and most likely will continue to do so for an extended period of time, or possibly forever. So we have less contact with the team, we have less visibility of what they're actually doing. How do we become more effective as leaders and managers in this situation?
So it's really interesting. It's just a fascinating point, and probably the only two things that will last longer than COVID itself will be the litigation and the thesis writing afterwards around all of these issues. So, I guess to start off with, I'd say I certainly don't have all of the answers, but I definitely have some observations. And one of the observations that I'd make is that sophisticated managers, more mature managers in their management style, have been leaning towards using different frameworks for understanding productivity for a long time anyway. So as much as leaders talk about, walking the shop floor, and there is an element in that is really important. So you can garner an element of productivity and culture from walking the shop floor. But so much more now, we have tools and data at our fingertips to be able to measure productivity and outcome. And we know that more sophisticated managers are managing outcomes and outputs, not the number of hours that your bum is in a chair or that a staff member's bum is in a chair. So I can have a staff member attend 10 meetings but not be effective at any of those meetings, or I can have a staff member that only attends 1 out of 10 meetings and makes a really valuable contribution that changes the course of that meeting and changes the outcome for the business. So productivity really needs to be measured in the outcomes that it achieves, and we now have the data and tools to be able to do that. So we can see, for example, everything. You can test the products, you can test the outputs of particular teams in terms of the work that they're producing. So I think that sophisticated managers have been looking at a lot more than just hours and visibility. That presenteeism argument has really reduced significantly I think the importance that it lays in most managers' minds. And I think that really sophisticated management we're starting to see this well before COVID, and it's just been a maturation once again of that post-COVID. So there's definitely an element to that. And the other element that goes side by side with that, and that is the element of trust, and the trust that you have in your employees. I was in fact just having a discussion just prior to coming onto this call, and someone said, how do you really know that the staff aren't just mucking around and, lazing about and being at home, not doing too much work? And the answer is because if they were if there was the type of person that was inclined to do those things, they would have been doing them in the office anyway. And I would have seen it, and I would have seen it not just because I'm walking past and saw that they were on Facebook or playing solitaire or whatever people do in those situations, in the past, particularly where people were holed up in offices. Remember, we've come to a situation over the last couple of decades where open plan meant that people were a lot more visible. Prior to that, we had people working in cubicles or offices where you really had no idea what they were doing. It strikes me as extraordinary that some, senior managers, CEOs and the like talk about, I've got to be, the staff got to be in the office, they've got to be visible. What CEO is in the office 5 days a week? You wouldn't be doing your job if you were sitting at your desk in the office 5 days a week. I'm on the road usually a couple of days a week. I was traveling a couple of days a week. So the illusion that somehow I had my finger on the pulse because I was in the office without using these additional tools to be able to measure the productivity of the staff and to measure the outcomes of what the staff are doing, engagement tools, measuring culture, all of these things, I think that was pretty illusionary in the past. And I think we shouldn't be too tied to it. I feel pretty comfortable that I trust my staff because we have a mature relationship with our staff. They know that I'm looking at the right things. I don't care if they take off 2 hours in the middle of the day to go to the gym because I know that they will get the job done to the expected standard. And if they don't, then there'll be a pretty mature conversation around what was preventing that productivity and what we can do to mitigate that trend.
So we are actually in the future going to be hiring for people that are there because they want to be doing the right thing. In other words, they actually possess a reasonably high level of emotional intelligence.
Absolutely. And I think that, you see in any business, the people and the managers that carry that degree of emotional intelligence and the capability to have those really nuanced conversations and difficult conversations at times. They are the managers that end up being more successful in businesses. They are the managers that rise like the cream to the top of the pile. So I don't think there's actually anything much new in that. I think that we're just appreciating it a lot more.
So the role of governance and risk mitigation, all of these things that relate to that, when everyone is working from home, when we have board meetings that are held virtually, I guess there's a lot of procedures, there's a lot of things that, quite frankly, I don't think really anyone's thought through. There's obligations on the workers' comp insurance or legislation that you've got to look after your workers, doesn't matter where they are. But the problem is now that they're sitting at home in a chair that you actually don't directly can control, at a screen that may not be optimal because they go to the Bunnings or whatever else is their circumstances. How do you see the sort of the whole framework around governance evolving to kind of enable of these situations so we get a new and, if you will, more functional paradigm sometime in hopefully not too distant future?
Yeah, it's such a great question. There's so many different parts to that question. So I'll try and touch on some of them. The first is that you talked about virtual board meetings and, this interview is virtual, board meetings are virtual, and there's so much that's changed around board meetings. Necessarily, boards have drilled more into a bit of detail over the last months because all of a sudden the best laid plans have been thrown up into the air. So there's a lot more scenario planning and cash flow testing and all of those sorts of things going on at nearly every business right around the country. A lot more testing of risk controls, things like that. So board meetings are not only happening electronically, but they're tending to happen at a different cadence, shorter, sharper meetings, but much more often. We're finding a lot of directors have discovered that they really were overboarded because they can't, they're struggling to manage the massive influx of both information and call on their time with regards to Zoom meetings. One of the great things about Zoom is, and not traveling, is everyone's a lot more available. So there's a lot more board meetings that are happening. And all of those are different ways of doing things, but we create the validity around those. So making sure, for example, that all of those small, short catch-ups are still minuted appropriately, that the proper governance controls are still in place, because at the end of the day, that is the new, at least for this interim period, that is going to be the new normal, and boards need to be able to rely on decisions that were made, whether it's virtually or otherwise. They're going to need to be able to rely on those decisions. So there's some really big implications for the way we meet, and broader than just the board meeting. Of course, a lot of the work that the Governance Institute's been doing is around, really, what might seem like a mundane thing, but AGMs. How do you run an AGM with a quorum if your constitution doesn't allow for a virtual AGM and you can't have more than 2 people in a room at one point in time? So there's some really practical implications around AGM and the Corporations Act and legislation that we've been working on as well. But I think the main point that I'd make around governance is the same rules still apply, that board meetings obviously still need to be appropriately monitored and minuted and all of those things, so that there is the validity in those board decisions, and particularly when it comes to quite rapid decision making, which has to happen in very volatile times. The other thing, of course, about governance in general, and it goes hand in hand with risk management, and we've spoken about that before, and risk management tools and frameworks become even more important to be dynamic tools for giving a framework or a lens through which decisions can be made in the business, and allowing businesses to potentially not just mitigate the risk that exists in the environment at the moment, but potentially even take on more risk at the moment, or at least calculated risk in different areas. And so that's why risk management plans are so important. And a perfect example, and I know we've had this conversation previously, is testing those risk management plans. We at the Governance Institute had a small leak in the ceiling in 2019, a hot water system burst, and we had to send all the staff to work from home. Now, it's not exactly a global pandemic, but it was a good test to test if we could have the staff working from home. Did we have the working from home checklists in place that staff have to sign off on a checklist to say, I'm working in a safe environment, I've got adequate natural light, I've got no cords around me that would propose a danger to my working space, my monitor is adequate, and my chair is okay, you mentioned the chair, all of those things. So we checked off all of those plans last year, and it meant that all we had to do was do an update in March this year. So checking against those risk management plans are really important, because ultimately you still have a duty of care to your employees. The basic legislative frameworks haven't changed, and you still owe that duty of care to your employees when they're working for you, irrespective of where they're working for you.
So on a lighter topic, both your organisation and ours at Catapult, we both rely on getting out to meet a lot of people. Networking functions, big industry functions, lunches with 200, 300 or 500 people. Well, maybe not so much anymore. And I remember the last big lunch I went to in December, and I can't remember, but there were several hundred people there, I know that much. And it was like, right, that doesn't mean we're never going to go out and shake another set of hands anymore. Of course we will. But the traditional way of networking amongst industry peers and meeting new associates and potential meeting prospects, whatever it might be, it's probably not going to come back in the same manner. It'll come back in different ways. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are. What are some of those different ways?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The world, at least for the time being, has changed fundamentally. And once again, looking at the tools that, and they're not new tools, they were always in place for networking, but providing those tools and opportunities for, what I'd call much more structured networking or more focused networking, rather than the accidental networking that happens at really, really large events. You think about those large events of 500 that you attend in the past, and not all networking is networking that is going to have a dividend for your business. You might go to that 500 person event and really not get much business out of it at all, or you might meet 2 people over lunch and get an enormous amount of work out of it. So I think that we need to once again be really careful that we don't, as a society, misplace our understanding of trust with familiarity alone. Trust isn't just built around familiarity. Trust is built through familiarity at the beginning instances, but trust is very much born about through competence and consistency and delivery on promises. And so I think that we can still do some of those initial meet and greets through different forums. I, for example, was on a forum just yesterday afternoon on Zoom with about 30 other CEOs, particularly with some of the networking tools. You can break down into smaller groups, and may that be issues based or sector based or on whatever basis. So you can definitely still meet new people and collaborate using electronic tools. I think the building of trust then comes down to making sure that it's a valued relationship, that you're delivering on promises, that you're demonstrating the capability, that give people confidence that you're going to be a trusted relationship going forward. So those things haven't fundamentally changed. I think we've often misplaced trust for familiarity. They're not the same thing. And I think that we can definitely build new relationships using digital tools. And quite intimately, I have to say also, I think that because you have to work a bit harder on digital platforms like Zoom and Teams and the other digital platforms that exist at the moment, I mean, number one, it's exhausting being on Zoom all day because you actually have to give a lot of energy to connect with someone via a digital platform. So there is an energy flow consideration to be had, but also it can be really quite intimate in that you learn a lot about a person. You're learning about where I sleep at the moment right now, and
Yes.
kids and dogs and all of those sorts of things. So I'm actually finding that I know a lot more about my staff and the real person behind the employee at the moment by seeing them in their home environment and the way that they interact in the home environment. So
That's very true. And I think one thing that actually happened that's kind of interesting is that when you've been meeting people physically in the past, in a meeting and whatever not, it's a certain ritual. You say, "Good day, how's your day been? Oh, how's the family? Da 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 da." And then you get into the meeting, and it's almost like a set agenda every time you meet someone for an hour. And because there's not the transport time and whatever not that we need to get to a virtual meeting, because I just opened the laptop and I click the button and we're here. And we don't have the same ritual around it. What it opens up for is that either you have a really compressed and very effective meeting. Okay, let's get on to business, which one of our section 27A, let's get on with it. Or you can completely meander at will because you actually have the time to do that you otherwise wouldn't. Yeah. And so we now create instead of a social interaction that is formulaic, it actually creates a lot more openness around, well, what do I feel like sharing? What's happening in my world? You just talked about, energy flow a moment ago, and it's, I can echo the same thing. I had 2 weeks ago, I spent, I think 9 hours on Zoom for the day, and I was rotten at the end of the day. And it's just like, I feel physically ill.
Yeah.
Was there something I ate? No. Did I not get sleep? No, I'm good. But what did I spent 9 hours on Zoom. Well, that's probably what it was. And we just need to accept that, hey, this is just a different way of being. Where I'm sure the teenagers around us going, well, this is how we always live, so what's your problem? But
yeah, and so I think as leaders, the other thing is that you need to make sure that you're conscious of that and that you're building in enough time for the subconscious niceties, social interaction time around the edges of meetings, because it can be the inclination, because Zoom is exhausting, to jump on and say, right, into the agenda. But I think sort of saying, okay, we've been going for an hour, let's have a 10-minute break. Everyone go and get some lunch or a coffee and come back, and we won't start for 15 minutes. And we just sit around and have a chat and really, I think you need to program in that time a lot more consciously and make sure that there's a good balance.
You run an industry association, and one of the things that I find interesting around any industry association is the fact that, particularly now as we all sit in small little offices or sit at home or wherever we've gone to, it's actually become harder, unless we're conscious about it, it's become harder to create one voice. And we probably more than ever before needed organizations like the Governance Institute and a whole lot of other organizations to create that one voice for us. So what do you see as the future around that? How does associations like yours become more meaningful and more relevant and really, really grab the membership? And on the other hand, how does, in this world of stifled communications, how do you remain effective in your, shall we call it, opinion leadership and directing, say, policy in the marketplace?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that there's a lot of challenges, but a lot of opportunity for associations. And I guess I'll talk about it at three levels. The first is, from the membership level, our members and potential members never needed us more. And we are actually seeing growth in membership at the moment, significant growth in membership at the moment, which is fantastic. And that's because in a disconnected community, people are looking for connection. They're looking for content so that they can upskill, but they're looking for content in what I'd call a strategic and focused, a curated sense. So there's so much information. Looking towards an association that will narrow that information down for you to trusted sources is really useful to try and circumvent the time wasting that can go on just searching blindly on Google for information that you need. So there's a lot of information, and of course the third thing there is upskilling. People are at the moment looking to make themselves as employable as possible, and so upskilling is a real energizing factor in what can be a pretty despondent time for many people. So we are seeing a lot of growth, not just in our membership but also in the uptake of our short courses, certificates and postgraduate education, as people are seeking to make themselves more employable and connect with a networked market in their sector. The final piece really there is the voice to government and the consolidated voice to government. Now, at the moment, there is an upheaval of so many elements of running a business, legislation. I was commenting only yesterday on everything from paid pandemic leave, which I was commenting on yesterday in the aged care sector, through to the Corporations Act and electronic execution of documents. At the moment, the Corporations Act still requires you to have a wet signature, which if you've got a company secretary or an EA in Victoria and a chairman in Sydney, that's not going to help you much. So we've seen a temporary movement with the Treasurer using his special powers to make an exemption under the Corporations Act until November. But, quite honestly, that's a change that would it seems to me would make sense to stay permanently, because haven't we well moved on beyond the days of wet ink signatures? It feels a little bit like telexes and faxes to me, quite frankly.
Yeah.
So there is a real role for industry associations, because particularly at the moment, businesses are focused on hunkering down and managing their businesses. And so it's really important for industry associations to conglomerate those voices, make sense of them, and then make them connected into the public policy networks that can make real change. And that's part of the role that we play. It's part of what our members really rely on us to do.
Understand. Yeah, very good. It's an interesting world that we're heading into.
It sure is. And I think many individuals and many businesses are doing it really tough at the moment, and we need to do the best we can to support them, to support their growth, to make sure that we're providing resilient communities where opportunities will abound in the future. And I take that role pretty seriously, and we do at the Governance Institute.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan. Thanks for coming on board our little session here today. Really appreciate your time, and no doubt we'll speak again soon.
Nice to talk to you, Mike.